Thanks very much. Jim McElroy is my name. Thanks for the various contributions about the housing problem. I just want to introduce another element of it, which is public housing. And I think the big problem that has occurred in Australia over the last period is the decline and fall of public housing, which is a conscious policy of neoliberal governments of, I have to say, both Liberal and Labor persuasion. But in Sydney, we've seen things like the sell-off of Millers Point, which is a tragedy, the destruction of a community. And in theory, they're saying that they're selling off Millers Point in order to build more public housing. They're not doing that. The New South Wales government is not building substantially more public housing, and I think my question would be relating to the question of the pressure on rents, which has been raised. One major way to solve the problem of rents for low-income people is to provide a substantial increased investment in public housing, a large-scale program of public housing which would actually have, and especially with interest rates for governments being so low, now is the time not to privatise everything, but to actually increase public ownership of housing, and that would provide housing for low-income people and take a lot of pressure off the rest of the housing system.
You just answered your question.
My question, yeah.
You just answered it.
No, I agree with what you have to say, but I'm sceptical that that's going to be the choice for the massive surplus that the state has this year. I wish it were, but I don't think it's going to be. But I agree.
Governments have been getting out of public housing for 20 years. They've been cutting back their involvement. They've got a deficit and they don't want to know about it, is the truth of it. And they want the money, so that's why they're selling the Millers Point stuff. And I don't know how to turn that around. That's a political problem, incidentally. It's not a practical problem. But the people who live in public housing are precisely where the biggest problems are. I have seen some positive initiatives on that score. I was quite impressed where there was some public housing units on excess land in the middle distance suburbs where they'd give it to a private developer who would redevelop it and mix up the public and private housing, so they got new public housing as mixed up with private housing, which was what financed the renewal of the public housing. So there have been examples where they're working in the other direction and people lived in much better public housing, because some of it's pretty run down and dreadful by now. But again, that's a social welfare problem, and it's something that a government has to put aside money to fix, one way or the other.
I'd add that government is falling short of money, and because it's gathering most of its money from income, and income is not growing comparatively with the needs of society, and also ideologically driven by neoclassical thought that everything should be converted into a business. So we're converting public housing into what they call social housing. I think Morrison went across to London to learn all about it, came back and said he had solved the housing problem.
Thank you again very much for an interesting exchange of views. Now my question is with regard to getting out of the bind. When there was a housing crisis, a housing market that crashed in the US, they bailed out the banks. They gave them generous financial packages, and they foreclosed on the homes anyway. And when they foreclosed on the homes and the homes deteriorated in value, they asked for another round of bailouts. Now, my question would be, what if instead of bailing out the banks, we bail out the homeowners who really need the homes? We bail out the first homeowners who really want and need the homes. In this, under the same terms and conditions that would have been generous to banks, so that they could own it, so that the banks will not foreclose the properties and keep them. And that, I think, would be an interesting transition into what Richard suggested, that we move from a regressive tax system to a more progressive land-based tax system. Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, Very good question. Actually, if you look back at how the last major crisis was dealt with, if you look at the Great Depression, a lot of the institutions that served for affordable housing in the United States subsequently were set up, came out of the solution that was developed at that time. But that was much more focused on stabilizing homeowners because that was seen as the way to stabilize finance. So it's as if we knew that lesson, but we've forgotten it subsequently.
Just a comment. Australian banks are not in trouble. To the contrary, yeah. I remember, 20 years ago, you look at the stock market and the banks, the big four banks would be spread down the first 200, and now they're concentrated in the first 10. And it's because they have a lot more power and they're operating like a monopoly, effectively.
Good. And then they can lend to the homeowners instead.
No, they won't. They'll look after their shareholders, and that's the way they behave.
Yes.
And so you got to change the rules on them. Is the truth of it. So the biggest mistake. Sorry. Well, you don't need to. See, the biggest mistake we ever did was to privatise the Commonwealth Bank, because when the Commonwealth Bank was there, all of the banks had to fall in line with what the Commonwealth Bank was doing, and they were charging sensible fees. And in those days, the margin for a housing loan over a bank bill rate was about 1.5% to 2%. Yep.
Now.
Not now, it's 4%. Because there's no effective competition within the big four in the banking system. There's none coming from overseas, which is what fixed it up for a while here. And you know the way through it, I mean, we won't do it, of course, would be for the Reserve Bank to set up housing loans and form another Commonwealth Bank and give effective...
Thank you for your informative talk. I'm just going to be a little bit provocative here, revolutionary in fact. Okay. Now, what do you think of the proposition that one way of resolving the housing affordability crisis is to treat housing as a basic human right rather than as a commodity? In other words, the problem of housing affordability is a symptom of a system based on commodity production and exchange and can only be resolved by addressing the root causes of the problem, the capitalist system itself, with its marketisation and commodification of a basic human right, the need for shelter. To quote from a submission made by a noted political economist to a report by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, Professor Frank Gelber, housing inequalities interact with labour and capital market inequalities to create cumulative patterns of social advantage and disadvantage. So it is very difficult to achieve the social goal of decent and affordable housing for all without addressing the economic forces that generate those inequalities. And historically, Australia's obsession with home ownership was ramped up after the Second World War by Liberal Prime Minister Robert Menzies in order to create amongst the general population an illusory sense of a stake in the system of private property ownership. That dream is now dead. We could look at the example of Vienna, where the provision of housing is seen as a public social responsibility, where there is a public as well as a political consensus that the government should have a large role in providing housing for its citizens. And the Mayor of Vienna was recently interviewed, and they said the idea of home ownership is not as ingrained here because there is a stronger social safety net. Social housing, or community housing, and social safety net from pensions to healthcare.
So your question was what? What was your question? To summarise it again.
On an alternative system outside of the existing system,
Okay.
moving away from the notion of home ownership itself, which is dying.
Okay.
Well, I think shelter may be right, but if people have got higher wages and there's more work available, then they have the means in which to buy their own homes and don't have to wait for welfare or depend on welfare to get a home. And I think people would prefer to have the wages such that they could actually buy a home. So I think the fundamental right is the right to work. And while ever you've got an oversupply of labour, or a seemingly oversupply of labour, because you've got an undersupply of expensive land, then you're going to have a problem with getting people employed.
It was interesting, you used the example of Vienna. There are lots of other European cities you could have used too. And I mean, that's the complexity. There are lots of societies that are thoroughly capitalist and not even particularly progressive in some ways, that where there are reasonable alternatives to home ownership. It's a result of how we have financialized home ownership that is reflected now, where home ownership becomes your ticket to old age security, your safety net in times of trouble. Those functions could be filled elsewhere.
I'm not one for system change, but I do see that if we have people who haven't got housing, that is obscene, and so I think it should be a goal of government to provide housing for everyone who needs it. We shouldn't have homeless people living in our cities or anywhere in Australia. We can afford that social safety net.
Hi, Kathy from Vogan from the Committee of Politics in the Pub. I wasn't going to ask a question, but that has, Jan and I have been just having a little chat to the side. So I feel that, this whole get a job, buy a house thing is collapsing. And of course it's collapsed largely because of the casualisation of the workforce. I don't know if you know, but a gender study last year at Sydney University, where they wanted to find out the proportion of male and female lecturing there, I'm a lecturer myself, they discovered that 75% of the staff were actually casual. The same is in the UK, the same in America, adjunct professors living in their cars. So we have this casualisation, which means that a bank will not lend you money to buy a house. I used to be a homeowner in Paris, but when I came back to continue my academic career here, I was casualised until, just a year and a half ago. And I'm back in that situation now because I was overworked. But on the other hand, we have the future where AI is coming to get our jobs. So we're wedged between these two things that we can't let both of those be a blind spot. We have to look forward and realise that so many people are not going to get any job at all. And we have to look forward to a way that people can be housed. Now, Carl Widerquist, who was the guest lecturer at Sydney University about a month ago, was talking about UBI. And of course, that would ideally assure everything that you need. But of course, to pay your basic rent, food, that kind of thing, keep you alive. And there are lots of good things that could come of that, very productive things. But the problem that we have is that, how do you actually assess how much people need? Because there's this infinite variability in the amount of rent that people pay or the mortgages. How would you actually standardise that? And of course, the only way, I think, to do that is to increase public housing. And then we pave the way for this kind of basic need being met in a standardised way. And we find a way towards the future. What do you think? Is this an alternative? Or, do you recognise that both of these problems, the casualisation of the workforce, which continues to today, must have started here in the academic sector about 15 years ago. At least I came back to Australia in 2004. It had already happened, but it's happening in lots of other sectors. And then AI ahead of us, which is going to kill 5 million Australian jobs within the next 15 years, the ABC has estimated. So how do all those people get housed?
That's an outstanding question.
Oh, right, thanks a lot. I get the easy questions. So let me just say on the labour market that this labour market is as weak as I've seen it in 20, 30 years. We still haven't recovered from the GFC. The labour market is a lot weaker than the unemployment figures would suggest. Wages growth is as low as it's been for an extremely long time, make that 40 or 50 years, and that's a symptom of the weakness of the labour market. The casualisation issue, I think, is a different one, but it's related. So all I would say to you is that as the economy does pick up over the next few years, and we're not looking at it picking up very quickly or very strongly, so we're looking at it, really 2.5% growth for 3 years, 1.5% growth in employment, not much more than the growth in the labour force, and so the unemployment rate stays high. But then, when it starts to pick up and we get out of the thrall of the GFC, then we will see a stronger labour market driving up wages again. And wages growth are one of the good things that help us to get out of the debt problem, because it reduces the real value of the debt and our ability to repay debt. So this is the worst of it now. On the housing problem, I think we get back to the sort of problem we've been discussing before. That really we need to work out a way of, I'm a bit pessimistic on that. And the reason I'm pessimistic is, see, they're saying that we should have super funds financing housing, basically. What is it? What's it called? They've got a name for it.
Oh, the blanking on it, MEDs.
Yeah. No. I'm thinking of it. They're saying the private sector should basically do rental housing, and the reality is there have been a number of attempts for the private sector to do that in Australia, and it's never worked, because effectively the yields on housing are too low, and capital growth on average is too low to make it a commercial prospect. And so don't believe anything you hear about them saying that this is the great solution and we're going to put, $40 billion into housing and that this is, build for rent housing. The reality is that mum and dad investors, the bad word investors, who have bought housing and then rent it out at a rent which doesn't give them enough yield to be commercial, but is enough for them. When the tenants wreck the joint, which they do sometimes, they go in and fix it up themselves. Basically, they do a better job than any of the commercial operations at a cheaper price, a cheaper rent for a given price.
Back to casualisation of employment. This is, I think, from my nephew, who tells me a lot of what's going on in the outer western suburbs. He works in a factory, but he's forced to take an ABN number, and he works as a casual, and this casual employment allows his employer to get out of a hell of a lot of otherwise costly things that he'd have to contribute to my nephew's salary. And why would this happen? Well, it's because the businesses themselves are finding it difficult to make a profit.
That's the issue. The issue here is that businesses now in Australia, as in other parts of the world, are competing on price because they're facing the Asian situation where their wages are lower and prices are lower, and this is business's response to it. It's not a good response at all. Next question.
I read recently that there are 136,000 vacant residential properties in the Greater Sydney area. This is roughly the number of homeless people throughout Australia, so they could have one house each. What do you think the reason for the large number of these vacant properties are? And what do you think what do you think could be done about it?
I actually looked at that. Over the last 5 years, the number of vacant properties has increased by 36,000, which is about half of the new housing supply that we've added in the Sydney metro area. So I think you're hitting on an incredibly important topic. As to what to do about it, I think perhaps the Chinese government is in the process of changing investment environments right now, and that might do more than the New South Wales government or Australian government could ever do. I think that's part of the issue. I think there are a lot of homes that have been bought and are sitting vacant. On the other hand, there are also a lot of homes that are massively overcrowded, where you have 12 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. But you're quite right. There are increasingly large number of homes that are not occupied. But I don't know how you regulate that.
Could you explain the Chinese, what you said about the Chinese connection to that?
Well, it's offshore investors is what I'm talking about. That, you know, there are a lot of new apartment blocks in the neighborhood I live in, and maybe 25% of the windows are lighted on any particular evening when you go by. It's not clear that all of the property that offshore investors have bought in Sydney is being occupied, that it's even in the rental system. And I don't know where else you get a 36,000 increase in vacant housing units from, because that's a big increase in vacancies.
Sorry, do you mean that we are relying on the restriction of capital flight out of China?
All I'm saying is it's unclear the New South Wales government is in a position to do anything about that.
Are they vacant on a given night, or are they?
No, they're vacant, period. This problem has occurred in London, it's occurred in New York, and there's a simple answer to it. No, simple, and I mean simple. Every building that's built like this for accommodation, they should allow 2 or 3 units there just for that purpose. There's plenty of space. The other reason why they're unlet is because they want to play the game that you mentioned before of increasing price. They're hanging on to it so they'll escalate more. Anyway.
No, I haven't got an answer because I don't know the size of the problem. If they're really vacant houses with nobody living in them, are they vacant? Why are they vacant is the question. Is it because the investors just left it sitting there like you're suggesting? Is it because they haven't got a tenant yet and they're still looking for one? Yeah. Is it because the owners are on holiday and they're being counted as vacant on census night? I mean, and so I don't know enough about how many are really vacant, you know, to be able to respond.
We don't count it.
I do know in the census, it was interesting, we used to speculate that in Melbourne, which is where we did this work, that a lot of the units being bought by Chinese investors were sitting vacant. We thought that they were, but came to the census, and actually it turned out that they weren't. That actually they were being filled by tenants or by the family of the investors themselves. And so I think we need to do more to understand the nature of the problem, that's all.
I just said that we could have a vacancy tax.
No data collection on that. And this,
We could have a vacancy tax. I think there's one in Melbourne. But as Frank said, there's all ways of getting around the law, and in fact the law may impinge on genuine people who are unable to get a tenant. Once you have a law, there are people who are working on ways to get around it. But there is a vacancy act, I think, in Victoria that puts a penalty on holding land out of use.
Thanks for very interesting talks from all three of you, but I was promised a fight and you guys all agreed way too much. So on the basis that we have 3 different solutions that you've proposed, I would like to see if the 3 of you can come to some kind of a consensus on the basis that most people, like politicians especially, have very limited attention spans. And if we can kind of focus in on one solution, maybe there's a chance of actually doing something about it. So can the 3 of you come to some kind of a consensus on, if we're going to do something, what's the one thing that the 3 of you would agree we should do?
Well, I'd say that the solution is this single tax idea, which brings about equal rights in land and clears up not only the housing problem, but as suggested, it clears up the wages and unemployment problem. It may not, but then again, if there's a better solution, as Henry George used to say, well, show me what it is. Now, in the meantime, you can say, well, we're not going to solve that problem. We're not going to attack a basic institution like private property in land and take away land price. Now we're going to accommodate to that problem. And the solutions that we've been looking at, I think, are a genuine attempts, sensible attempts to accommodate to the problem without attacking the root of the problem.
I think taxing wealth and property is one of the commonalities across the three. You were also in favour of that, Frank?
I'm not sure.
Right, okay. That may be as close as we get to.
2 out of 3 is not too bad. Next question.
Richard, you mentioned earlier that land is privately held. I'd like to challenge that. If you look at the certificate of title on the Torrens title, it describes the landholder as the tenant. And the Torrens title is just a subsidiary title. If you look at the primary title, which is the deed of title in the old system, the title holder, the landholder, is described as the title holder in fee simple. The fee being an annual rent other than military service, which replaced the few in the feudal times was military service. So as the law stands now, the title holder, the landholder, should be paying rent. And there's all this back rent that the state, or those that control the state, haven't collected for about 200 years. So I'd like your comment on that. And if we collected all that back rent, then people's income taxes and all sorts of other taxes could be refunded to them quite easily for the past couple hundred years also. Then, as far as the banks go and all the debt that people have, well, if someone's a tenant, how the hell can they say, oh, this is my house or land or factory or whatever, I'll borrow money and this is the security? It's a fraud. And the money, where does the money come from? It's merely book entry. It's really fraudulent, the whole thing. So people's mortgage payments should be returned to them with a penalty paid by the banks. And as far as foreign ownership of land in Australia, the Act of Settlement 1701 prohibits non-native born people from holding land titles, even under trust. And the Act of Settlement the Act of Settlement was a British Act of Parliament which no Australian Parliament has the power to amend or repeal.
Sorry, my only comment on that is that's not the way the system actually works. And we haven't told the legal system this yet, but it may very well be true.
They all know they've hidden it. They all know. It's known.
But it's not the
it's
way
the
it
law.
works.
It's the written law of the land.
Well, that may be written, but that's not the way they work the system. And
Well,
apart from that, I'll let it go.
They're
through
working
the
it
keeper.
fraudulently and illegally.
Have you told them that?
Well, many people have told them that. They don't want to listen. We need to get control of the state.
Next question.
And what about the banks, the bank stuff, the mortgages and all that? Can someone address that, please? Richard, I like Richard's comment. That's who I asked.
Oh dear. Well, I'd agree with Frank. That's not the way the system works. The system was set up by William the Conqueror and then corrupted in the 17th century during the Civil War, and when the landowners claimed the rent of the land for themselves and provided no services to the state, and I think the system was defunct from that point onwards.
By quite a few people's standards, I'm a very successful landowner. I have a lovely stone house in Balmain East too. And I am disgusted by affordable housing as a concept and in its practice. I am disgusted by the fact that really, in the end, what it becomes is a guarantee of rental payment to the developers. And I am disgusted to be in a society that would enable that to happen. I went to the Sydney Greater Commission that said, we don't need any development east of Parramatta. We need the pearls, the string of pearls to be developed, the satellite cities. And here I am in Balmain about to be suffocated by WestConnex. Now, I hotly oppose WestConnex. I also am hearing that St Peter's Interchange, I think it was on Facebook just this week, is now proposing some very large development. Now, whether WestConnex continues or not, and I hope it won't, and we get what we need, public transport, rail and light rail first, and then see what dregs we can give to international companies. I believe that what should happen is that all the land that is cleared so far and whatever is cleared in the future in relation to WestConnex projects and the links, all be handed over as genuine quality social housing. Now, when I say quality social housing, I'm not talking about the disaster that we heard about in London. I'm not talking about sick beds where developers develop very small, inadequate, unsafe material-based developments. I'm talking about quality developments. I am proposing a very practical solution, and that is starting with St Peter's Interchange, that no developer should benefit from developing housing as the Sydney Greater Commission had advised east of Parramatta, and that all of those ruined heritage areas, green spaces and cleared lands be given over to social housing. And that is not affordable housing, not just for the professionals that elite society requires to stay close to them, but genuinely based on social need.
So is the comment or a question?
I am asking each of you to come on board and to make a comment about how you can turn around not affordable housing, but genuine social housing based on genuine social need.
Good question.
Yes, well, I don't know about the conversation, but as soon as this idea of social housing, that is giving housing over to private enterprise occurred, my wife said, well, what sort of houses are they going to get? What are they going to get? If you force a developer by extortion, by saying that we're not going to give you a development application, we weren't going to pass your development application until you give so much, what sort of accommodation is he going to give? And I think she had a good point. And it was been proved. Eh?
Don't do it. Just don't do it.
Oh, well, that you'd have to tell the government they shouldn't be out extorting
That's what I'm
social
saying.
housing from people.
Yes, our economists and others here. Don't do it unless it's for genuine social gain.
There's a really great record of outstanding social housing in other countries. We have some good examples here. If WestConnex gets...
Where are the examples here?
I think there are some decent ones in Piermont. I think some of what has been achieved by inclusionary zoning in that example, it's well located, it's decent looking.
Not Carriage Works. Not Harold Park development. I'm sorry, I don't know. You have to give me an answer.
It's an entirely unobjectionable idea. Stop WestConnex, build social housing in its place, but good luck with that argument. There's a realistic element to this. How do you? Yeah, that would work.
Where do I leave?
I think they're just. Yeah.
No, I pass. It's not us you've got to convince.
But the WestConnex links may not be of interest unless the developments if the developments weren't going to go ahead?
That's a good question. A lot of good questions. What a lovely evening. I thought this would be a peaceful evening. It's been very invigorating and very, very thoughtful. Now, next week, you've got another very important issue, and we're all going to be in the boat on this one, and that is greed. This is the topic, greed as the motive in residential care for the elderly. Think about that one. Yeah. The speakers are Paul Sadler, CEO of Presbyterian Aged Care, New South Wales and ACT, and Adele Ferguson, who we all know about her if we watch the ABC. She's at the ABC Four Corners Journalist. That's a very important topic. I'm looking forward to that one. It's going to be terrific. Thanks very much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next week.